today we've got Jay Nicholson, one of our members, who's going to take us all to Shetland and share the delights of the Scottish shores. Over to you, Jay.
Right, thank you very much. Hello and welcome to my tour of Shetland. Right, so exactly where is Shetland? Well, here it is in red here. It's the most northerly part of the United Kingdom. And to give you a few miles, I heard Robert talking about that earlier, it's 386 miles to Edinburgh. It's about 600 miles to London, but actually only 229 miles from Bergen in Norway. So that gives you an idea of its northerly latitude. So this is Scotland, and there's the very north coast of Scotland. You first come to the Orkney Islands, and then you come to Fair Isle, where we're going to start our tour, which is one of the Shetlands, and then the main group up there. The principal city is called Lerwick. It's not like Berwick. You don't pronounce it Lerwick, you pronounce it Lerwick. So this is how we got there. It was extremely easy. We just got on a plane at Exeter, and it flew us to Manchester, and then on to Inverness, I think, and then on to Sunbury in Shetland. These are the main islands that we're gonna, and I'll show you the ones that we're going to visit today. Going from south to north, we're going to see Fair Isle, Musa. We're going to see the mainland of Shetland, Bressay and Noss, Muckle Row, and then Fetlar and Unst. Muckle Flugga is a tiny uninhabited island at the very, very top. I only mention it because it is the most northerly of the Shetland Islands. Right, let's start in Fair Isle, home of that very famous bird observatory, and a place where strange migrants turn up virtually without fail every spring and autumn. Now, to get to Fair Isle, you have to go on this boat called the Good Shepherd. Here it is in the port of Sunbury, which is called Grutness, and this is one of the friendly crew. It's a very small boat. It carries about 20, and there is its route out of Sunbury. And it takes about 2.5 hours actually to get to Fair Isle on this boat. There's a picture I took of it from Sunbury Head, starting out on one of its journeys. And you can see that this one's actually got a car on board. So just shows that on Fair Isle, it's a very small island, but they do have some cars. And as you sail into Fair Isle, the North Lighthouse is the very first thing that you'll see on top of its very imposing cliffs here. These cliffs are full of birds, as we'll see in a minute. The other way of getting here is to fly on this little plane, but that's a risky enterprise because, like when we were there, for example, there were people stranded for 5 days because the plane couldn't fly because of weather conditions. Here's one of the birds I saw on the way over, and I photographed on a lovely blue sky there. And that's obviously it's a great black-backed gull. And there are enormous numbers of northern gannets, which are very beautiful birds when you see them in good light. However, the day we arrived, there was a much more auspicious visitor, which we were very, very lucky to see. And that was this fellow. This is the black-browed albatross. It's a small albatross. It's only got an 8-foot wingspan, but it's not really supposed to be here at all. It's a southern hemisphere bird. It should be in the South Atlantic, but this particular one is well known, actually. It's obviously at some stage got hopelessly lost, and it lives in the North Atlantic and North Sea, centered around the German Bight, actually, and it cruises around, and on this particular day it was visiting Fair Isle. So here's Fair Isle itself, which is approximately 5 kilometers long and about 2.5 wide at its widest point. And where the dotted line comes in is exactly the place where you land. And if you look slightly below that, you can see bordered in blue the words bird obs. That's the bird observatory, the very famous bird observatory on Fair Isle. So here's the place where you land, the North Haven it's called, taken from the south. And almost as soon as you get there, that you see lots of these. These are shags. They occur in very large numbers. There's about 30 birds in this group, but that was only part of a much, much larger flock. And on land, you could see some breeding shacks, like here. I love this photo because the light conditions are perfect, and you can see why it's sometimes called a green cormorant. Can you see the little baby shag poking out from underneath its mother there? And these birds, lots of these, of course, these are guillemots. They look darker. The poorer the light is, you know, in very good light, they look a kind of a chocolate brown color, but in very bad light, they look black. These are razorbills, which always look darker, actually. And here's everyone's favorite, the puffin. More about them in a minute. You know, here they are taking off, going back to the cliffs, and they live on the cliffs right next to the bird observatory, actually. And here's the nearest thing we have to an albatross. On the cliffs of Fair Isle, there are hordes of these petrels. Of course, it's a Fulmar petrel. More about them in a minute. Here they are, looking pretty amongst the pinks. This is an interesting fact that the Good Shepherd won't go back for 3 days, and that's how long we were there, actually. And they actually pull it out of the water on special rails. Here's Diet at a pretty picnic table in the North Haven, and you can see the boat, the Good Shepherd, in the background, which is being pulled up on its ramp into a special little gully, which seems to be just made for the job. A short walk takes you to the observatory. The Fair Isle Bird Observatory is affectionately known as FIBO for short, Fair Isle Bird Observatory. It's purpose-built and a very modern facility, incredibly comfortable and clean and warm. And it costs about £70 a night to stay there. And for your £70, you get full use of the place and 3 meals a day. And the use of the lounge and the library. And of course, you get to meet lots of other interesting people. There's only one trouble. I'm afraid in 2019, there was an absolutely devastating fire there, and apparently the whole place has been destroyed. But such is the power of the birdwatching community that they're already well on their way to restoring it. There was a big fundraising effort, and they reckon it's going to open again in 2023. Around the observatory, there's some lovely views to explore here. Look at these lovely sea arches. And by one of those arches there's a cliff which is absolutely covered with Fulmar petrels. But I took a count here, and I think I counted 200 birds in this one view. Fulmars are reasonably fearless, and they let you get quite close to them. Everywhere you go, you find fulmars. You know, these are sort of nesting behind a wall, nestling, I should say, behind a wall to keep out of the wind. And when they nest in the cliffs in very sort of safe places. They're quite talkative, shall we say, very cackly birds, especially when another bird lands nearby, as you can see here. They do spend a lot of time sleeping, but they're when they do go off, they go off on epic flights. I'll talk about that in a minute. You can see the beak here, which is beautifully designed with this tube on the top, which actually causes them to be a petrel, or procalaridid, as the scientific name. It's in fact two tubes inside one outer tube. I found this egg on the path as I was going along. It had a big hole in one side where it either hatched or a predator had sucked out the contents. I'm not sure which, but it struck me as being a really big egg for such a small bird. And so it prompted me to do a bit of research. And it turns out that petrels do have big eggs for their size. They take a lot of hatching. They actually incubate the eggs for 50 days. Oh. Right. The babies, when they hatch, even though that they've been incubated for such a long time, they are totally helpless. They're not like gull chicks, you know, with all their feathers. Fulmars are fantastic flyers, and they've been extensively studied. I hope everybody's read a book by a man called Jay Nicholson, who is absolutely no relation of mine, I may add. But Adam has written this fantastic book called The Seabird's Cry. And if you ever want to know anything about seabird behavior, that's the book to go to. He actually geotagged one, which was called 1568. It nested in the Sheant Islands, which his family owns actually in the Hebrides. And it was recorded as leaving its nest, and it flew 2,900 miles in a circular tour of the Atlantic before coming back to his nest to relieve his mate sitting on the egg. And it'd actually been gone for 2.5 weeks. So in that 2.5 weeks, he'd covered 2,900 miles. Such is the life of a fulmar. They feed on fish and digest them to form very viscous oil, which they store in special pouches in their stomach. And they feed this oil to their babies. And if you're not careful and you get too close to them when they're nesting, they are known for spitting this disgusting smelling oil at you. And they're very accurate apparently with their spitting. Actually, other birds, big gulls and things, have obviously learnt that you don't go near one of these, because this oil is so viscous that it mats their feathers to such an extent that they can't fly and they die. The name fulmar is derived from the Norse, and it actually means foul gull because of this habit of spitting this oil. Right, a half an hour's walk from the observatory and you get to the North Lighthouse. Here it is. Unfortunately, when we got there, it was thick fog and you could hardly see anything, I'm afraid. In fact, there's a very famous gannet colony there, but we were totally unable to see it. But we did find this fella sitting on because he came incredibly close and he was piping and getting really frantic at our presence. And then we realized why, because under our feet almost there was this little baby, which we watched for ages, and it did not move a muscle, and we decided it must be dead, you know, but in fact it wasn't dead at all. Right, now just outside the observatory on the edge of the cliff there, you can see there's a puffin colony, as I mentioned before. They used old rabbit burrows and burrows which they dig themselves. In the evening, they actually gather. It's almost like they're having a bedtime chat. They all stand around and cackle at each other. They pop in and out of their burrows in the soft, sandy soil. They're reasonably confiding birds, and they'll let you get quite close, providing you approach carefully and slowly and don't make too many sudden moves. They just sit and look at you, and they get on with their own business. Now here's one gathering nesting material. And when he thinks he's got enough, he takes it down into his burrow. I think I've got a picture here. Yeah, there's the puffin going down into its burrow. And this one is showing us its wings, which are very stubby and short. And they're a good compromise because great long wings wouldn't be any good for diving under the water. And these wings are, as I said, they allow it to fly, but also they allow it to swim underwater as well without causing too much drag. The bills are very beautiful in the summer when we see them, but actually in the winter time they shrink and become much duller, losing all their bright colors. Their face turns from white to gray as well. But it's not as if anybody's ever going to see one. In fact, I've never met anyone who's ever seen a puffin in the winter because they spend the winter right out in the middle of the ocean. Here's another beauty, which we found on Fair Isle. This is a northern wheatear, of course. And this charming picture I took of one which was obviously sunning himself on a warm rock. Wheatears actually winter in Central Africa, and they come back here in March. And here's another bird which we found on the shore there. That was this is a common pied wagtail. This one is the British subspecies, actually called Yareli, which distinguishes them from these ones, which are called white wagtails, which are a continental version, and these are Alba wagtails. So ours is a Yareli and this is an Alba. Now, this is a terrible picture. I apologize, but I really could not get any closer to this bird. But if you look right in the middle, you'll see a yellow wagtail with a dark head. It caused quite a stir at the observatory because it was a very rare bird. It was a blue-headed wagtail. And this one, which is very similar bird, but without the dark head, this is just a common or garden grey wagtail, such as we see in North Devon here. Once again, they were reasonably happy to find that on Fair Isle. On Fair Isle and the Shetlands in general, you'll find people get incredibly excited about quite normal birds. Like, you know, on Shetland, I remember someone getting really excited because they'd seen a blue tit, because they just don't get them there normally. This is the grey wagtail looking pretty and looking at me, actually. And here's another migrant, and this one's been ringed. They do a lot of ringing on Fair Isle. In this case, this one is a lesser whitethroat. And here he is being ringed. There are lots of starlings, which are very extensively studied on Fair Isle. So all the starlings you see there have got lots of rings on, like here. And whoops, yeah, there you go. And that one's got lots of coloured rings on its feet. It's strange enough, the starlings on Fair Isle don't nest in holes in trees or in houses. They nest under rocks on the ground. Now, there are lots of these on Fair Isle. There's beautiful little finches, which we don't get down here. Well, on very rare occasions anyway. They're called twite. So, or mountain linnets, a version of the linnet, which you find in northerly parts. Outside the bird observatory, there's a feeder, and you get lots of these twites on the feeders there. There's a good picture of a twite at the feeder. And it's actually showing, you can just about see it there. One of its diagnostic features is a pink rump. You can see just under the feathers there, you can see the rump. And there are lots of these birds, of course, which are meadow pipits. They're common all over the moors on Fair Isle. Not to be confused with this much grayer, less strikingly marked bird, which is a rock pipit. One day we visited the museum on Fair Isle, which is named after this chap, George Waterston, who was a great birder back in the 40s and 50s. Unfortunately, he was served his time in the army, and during the Second World War on Crete, he was actually captured and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. But apparently it didn't deter him, and he carried on studying migrating birds even inside the prisoner of war camps. And he even wrote a paper which was published in a German scientific journal of the time. Inside the museum, there's many artifacts of life on Fair Isle, mainly to do with fishing and other seafaring activities. I love their life jackets here. Of course, Fair Isle is most famous for its knitwear, and there's lots of exhibits showing the knitting tradition on Fair Isle, and lots of examples of the famous Fair Isle patterns. This chap is a member of an early Antarctic expedition who's been kitted out in a Fair Isle jumper to wear to the Antarctic. And these are all Fair Isle patterns here. One evening while we were there, a cruise ship arrived, and disgorging its load of yellow jacketed tourists. They all swarmed ashore, and of course it brought out the knitters, because this is one of the moments they wait for. They all gather in the village hall and display their latest creations, and hoping to sell them to these boat-bound tourists. By the way, they are pretty expensive, these jumpers. One of them might set you back a few £100s. There's also a fairly famous artist who lives on Fair Isle. He's called Tommy Heineman. He's an American. He's the guy here you can see in the shorts. And this is his son, who got 15 minutes of fame by being on a national magazine cover, wearing his lovely Fair Isle jumper, but because there was a fall of waxwings, and these birds were incredibly tame, as you can see here. So I'll finish this little section by saying that this is what I came away with: a neck warmer and a jumper and a woolly hat from my time in Shetland and Fair Isle in particular. And here's Di wearing hers as well, which was a beautiful hand knitted jumper, not machine knitted, totally made by hand. And while we're on Fair Isle, I did take the chance to do at least one transect, although unfortunately it wasn't particularly interesting. So back to the birds, and here's me after one of the island's iconic breeders. I had to approach behind this wall to get close to it, but I included this picture because I just love all the lichens, which shows how clean the air is there. And here's a picture that Di took of me with the bird in my sights. It is, in fact, an Arctic skua. This is a very beautiful, very powerful, aggressive bird. It occurs in two morphs, as we say. This is the less usual pale morph, a pale morph Arctic skua. Like I said, it's a powerful, aggressive bird, and they make their living by chasing other birds who've caught fish and harrying them so much that they cause the bird to to drop what they've caught so that they can pick it up. Pirates, if you like. This one started to display at me and did some mock charges, and she even had a pronounced limp, which I think was just trying to fool me that she was injured, which is all behavior which is designed to lead you away from their nesting site. Although, may I add, there was no nest at this point. We were a bit late. We were there in early June, and I think they'd finished nesting by then. Here she is in flight. And when you see them from a certain angle, you see that they have these interesting central tail feathers which stick out beyond the end of their tail. Now here's the other morph, the dark morph. In fact, I did find that actually this is quite variable, actually. So this seems to be a kind of intermediate form here. These, as I said before, I think they're probably a bit more numerous than the paler ones. And there's the outline, which once again says Arctic skewer because of the tail feathers. See, now this one is much darker. And there it is flying again. Now this is the top bird of Fair Isle. This is the great skewer, which I shall refer to by the more familiar name of bonksy. Like I said, these are the top birds of Fair Isle, and start to stretch its wing there, and you can see the telltale white pattern which it has on its wing. You can see much better here as it's flying. They're kind of white bases to their primary wing feathers. They patrol the skies here, and they're, as I said, the top bird, the most powerful bird on Fair Isle. But my pale-faced Arctic skewer took great exception to this bonksy passing, and she went in for the attack. And it was interesting to watch. The last picture, I'm afraid, I didn't get. It wasn't in focus, but I'm including it because I love it so much, because it really looks as if the Arctic skewer is biting the bonksy in a very painful place, and the bonksy is screaming in pain. Great picture. Shame it wasn't in focus. Anyway, we say goodbye to Fair Isle now, and we're going on to the south of the mainland of Shetland. Yeah, unimaginatively, I'm afraid, the main island of Shetland is called mainland. And at the very bottom there, you can see Sumburgh Head. That's where we're headed first. We had a hire car waiting for us when we got there, and motoring in Shetland is very easy. You don't need a 4x4 or anything, because the roads are absolutely superb. They are the best conditioned roads I've ever seen anywhere in Great Britain. They're magnificent, and most of the highways like this have got 2 lanes, but the smaller roads are single track like this, but with numerous passing places. There's passing places every couple of 100 yards. So getting around is no problem. It's not as if there's a lot of traffic anyway, as you can see. Anyway, all these wonderful roads are due to of course, the oil industry, which finances them, because there's very rich deposits of North Sea oil up there, which come ashore in Shetland, a place called Sullom Voe. And travel between the islands is very easy as well on these roll-on, roll-off ferries, and really quite cheap as well. It's not something that you need to be concerned about when you're budgeting for a trip there, because the actual fares are just a few pounds. At Sumburgh Head, there are large seabird colonies. for you to look down on. These are all guillemots, I believe. I haven't checked every single one, but I did try to count them in this picture. And if you look closely, you can see where I've actually spent hours actually going over this and writing numbers on. And if you look at the very bottom right-hand side, you'll see 784. And that's how many I actually counted. Nearly 800 birds in this one picture. A few ducks for you to see, of course. As everywhere in the world these days, you'll find mallards. But more excitingly, eiders, lots and lots of eiders. These are exclusively marine ducks, and they're found in the north much more than they are down here in the south. We would see them occasionally, but up there they're really quite common. And this is a female eider, an eider duck. And here's one I found, who is leading her little babies to water for the very first time. So I followed their progress. There are 6 little babies here. There she goes, taking them down to the water's edge and in. And they didn't seem at all perturbed. They'd never seen water before in their life, I doubt it. But they were soon in there, bobbing around quite happily. And everywhere we went on Shetland, we found groups of eiders. Here's a group of adult birds, which seems to be mainly ducks. But just as likely, you'd be able to find flocks like this, which were mainly drakes, of course. Here's an eider drake who's surfaced with a fetching garland of sugar kelp wrapped around his body, which is quite amusing. And these are shelled ducks, which are also largely marine ducks. Once again, a common bird up in Shetland. These shell ducks were leading their family of 2 little ducklings. I'm sad to say. Shell ducks lay between 8 and 16 eggs, I read. So you can only imagine what's happened to the other, but there were only 2 left. And on the way up to the lighthouse, we came across these 2 Arctic terns. This is the tern that you find most in Shetland, and one of them was presenting the other one with a tasty sand eel, obviously part of a mating ritual. Here's the Arctic terns in flight. These are by far and away, as I said, the most common tern in Shetland. How do you tell an Arctic tern from a common tern? Right, well, here's a prime example. Its tail streamers are longer than its wingtips. It has got very short legs, and it's got a totally red bill. And I've included a picture of a common tern for comparison. Longer legs, shorter tail streamers that don't reach to the end of the wings, and a black tip to their bill. These, although they're common terns, they're not anywhere near as common as Arctic terns in Shetland. And here's a nice picture of an oyster catcher taken in beautiful light on, I think it was on the edge of a golf course there. Now we're up to the lighthouse in Somborough Head, which also serves as an RSPB reserve. The cliffs just below this lighthouse are spectacular and very easy to scan, and of course full of all sorts of interesting birds. I got up very close and personal with some twites here sitting on the wire, beautiful little finches. And a skylark. This is a skylark actually that was busy gathering grubs and things, obviously to feed babies, which it had somewhere. Right, now onto the cliffs themselves, where of course there are fulmars, as there are everywhere. And I could see below us some auks sitting on the cliffs. Pardon me. This is razorbills. And of course, lots and lots of puffins. In fact, I've never got so close to puffins as I did here.
Fantastic.
Beautiful pictures. So that's how close you can get. Marvelous. There's me in the hat filming, I think, actually some puffins, which are just feet away from us. Such picturesque, beautiful birds. Sort of posing with some thrift. Once again, their stubby little wings showing nicely here. Okay. I think I'm all puffined out now. Ah, that's a lovely one. And here's one going to sleep. Right next to Sunborough Lighthouse there's this prehistoric village, which I'll show you a little bit about. It's called Yarshof, and it was inhabited apparently for 3,000 years or 4,000 years, as it says here. And it has been inhabited by various people over the years, including Picts and Vikings. And it was buried in sand, and then, as with the case of that place Skara Brae in Orkney, one day there was a storm which uncovered a lot of these remains, which were then excavated, and they're in amazing condition. When you think this place was apparently built in about 800 BC, so they're in remarkably good condition. This is called a wheelhouse, and you see why. Here's a picture of what it looked like when it was occupied. Circular houses with buttresses. And that's what they would look like. Actually, they were only vacated in about 1500 and something. That's the hotel, Sunborough Hotel in the background there, where we stayed for a couple of nights before we departed from the airport. All right, so next we're going to drive up from the south to halfway up the island. Can you see there near the top of the map, there's a little bird and it says Loch of Spiggy. Well, that's where we're headed for, the Loch of Spiggy. Here's the Spiggy Hotel, which was the next place we stayed at. Which is, sits right on the edge of the loch, and as you sit in the dining room having your dinner or breakfast or something, you look out over the loch and see all sorts of interesting birds. My friend, traveling companion Peter, found a few moments to cast a fly. I don't think he caught anything, but it's a lovely place to fish. There's lots of this lovely cotton grass there. And on the Loch of Spiggy, we found whooper swans. They're supposed to migrate to northern Scandinavia and Arctic Russia to breed, but that's what all the standard textbooks say anyway. But it's in fact not quite accurate, because we found lots of breeding whooper swans in Shetland. Now, these were actually on the Loch of Spiggy near the hotel. And you can see that there are some babies there, although they were all hidden amongst the reeds. So I was a bit frustrated because I couldn't count how many babies they had. But then a little later, as we were driving away, we saw from a distance, we saw this lovely sight of her taking to the water, and you can easily count them now. There were 6 baby whooper swans. So forget what you read in the books. Whooper swans do breed in the United Kingdom. On the shores of the loch, we saw lots of these bonxies and great blackback gulls. In fact, the bonxies seem to gather every night and spent a lot of time splashing around in the water. And we could only assume that they were actually washing the salt out of their feathers after a day at sea. We found a few waders on the shores of the loch here, including this lovely little ringed plover. These are typical plovers. A lot of these birds you can identify as much by their behavior as you can by their plumage. A plover, for example, like this, spends a lot of time standing stock still and then moves in a very sudden short burst and then stops and stands stock still again. And it's a good ruse, actually. It makes them hard to spot. Unlike these chaps, the dunlin, this is the dunlin with this lovely little black tummy here, you can see, but also the beautiful markings of their summer breeding plumage. And here's a redshank, all familiar to us down here, I know, but there are lots of them up there as well. And they do a lot of this, which is called posting, which involves standing on a post and calling to mark your territory. Looks like he's only got one leg, this one, doesn't he? I guess the other one is tucked away somewhere. And here's another common bird up in Shetland, the whimbrel. It's like a curlew, but its beak is shorter and it's got a stripy head. You notice it's got a dark stripe across its crown. Here's the actual curlew to show you the difference. You know, the head has not got the crown stripe and the bill is much longer. I go back, look, there's the whimbrel, there's the curlew. Have you ever wondered what a baby curlew looks like? I mean, are they born with a beak like that? Obviously not. You know, so I was delighted to actually find this little baby curlew with its mother there, well, you can see the beak is much shorter. Makes you wonder how long it takes them to grow it. Right, just above the hotel, there's this beach, Scouseborough, is it called? Anyway, we were looking at this beach and wondering about these tracks, and it's obvious what made them. I'm sure I don't have to point out to you, but there across the other side of the bay were what had made the tracks, and of course they are seals, common seals in this case. We counted up to 65 common seals on this stretch of beach. It's a very isolated beach, actually, very hard to get down to, which is probably why it's favoured by the seals. When they're young, they're pure white, and as they get older, they sort of gradually get darker and darker. You could see them from the top of the cliffs here, you could see them swimming. They're fantastic swimmers. And common seals like to rest in this strange position with their heads and their tails raised up. Peter looking quite bored there. Yes, we have to stop at another knitwear place on Shetland mainland. And there we met this lady who's apparently, if you're into knitting, she's quite famous. She's called Wilma Malcolmson, and she runs this firm called Shetland Designer. Of course, there are all sorts of wonderful Shetland designs on show in her establishment. Hats and scarves and gloves and socks and everything else you can think of. And just the other side of Lerwick, there's a textile museum at a place called the Bod of Gremister. And here's a typical sight in Shetland of a newly made garment actually drying on the rack. I guess they wash it for the first time and they dry them on these racks so they keep their shape. And once again, we saw all these wonderful Fair Isle and Shetland designs. A quick look at some of the beautiful places we visited on the mainland. This is Esheness Lighthouse in the far northwest of the mainland. And this rather beautiful loch is at a place called Gunnister. And this is a place called Urra Firth. I hope you're getting the picture that there's actually not a lot of tourists here. You know, you go there and you do have the place to yourself most of the time. Remember, this was in mid-June. And there's another place called Burra Firth, the pretty waterfall. And these rocks are called the Drongs, up in the far northwest of Shetland mainland. Right, one evening we went on a very strange journey, which is one of the pilgrimages that you have to make if you're a birder in Shetland. It involves taking a boat from Sandwich on the mainland there to this little island you can see called Musa. And if you look at the blue thing on Musa, it says Broch of Musa. That's where we're headed. This is the Broch of Musa, seen in the early evening light as, sorry, I should just say the evening light. It's not early at all. But a broch is a prehistoric building made of stone, dry stone. This one is the best preserved broch in Europe. It's about 40 feet high. And it's thought to have been built in about 100 BC. It's quite an amazing structure. There's actually a spiral staircase built into the wall, and you can climb up inside the wall. You can climb up to the top. But it's interesting because it's where all the bird watchers who go to Shetland go at night. You have to go there at night, and this picture would have been taken at around midnight. Remember, there's not a lot of darkness in Shetland at this time of year. And I'm hoping that noise, which is what we heard standing next to these stones. And you know, I don't know if you can guess what makes the noise, but it's these fellas, which flutter around your face as the darkness falls, and you're standing there. They come back from the sea. They won't come back until it's pitch dark, and they flutter around your head like bats. And they're tiny little birds, actually. They're only the size of starlings. They're called storm petrels, of course. There's about 6,800 breeding pairs of storm petrels just on the island of Musa. And once again, like their bigger cousins, the former petrels, they lay quite a large egg for their size, and it takes, same as the former actually, it takes 50 days to hatch. But they're very strange, these eggs, in that I've never heard this before in a bird, but they don't need sitting on continuously. They can actually brood them for a little while and then go off and leave them, and come back a couple of days later and brood them again. So that's unusual, because most birds, if they don't sit on their eggs, then the egg would die. So here's a storm petrel doing what it normally does, and they're out in the ocean, dabbling up the surface, catching tiny little crustaceans and things. And just like former petrels, they convert the food into a viscous oil, which they take back and they feed to their young. Storm petrels are, even though they're so small, they have been known to live for 30 years, which is quite remarkable for such a small bird. Okay, so now we're going to see St. Ninian's Isle, which has got the most amazing geographical feature connecting it to the mainland. As you can see, it's up on the top left there, and it's called a tombolo. A tombolo is like a double-sided beach. Here's the St. Ninian's Isle tombolo here. You can see there's sea on either side of it. There it is from the other side. And we walked across there onto the island. On the way, we came across some eider nurseries, which are quite common in Shetland, as you can imagine. All right. A few little facts about these eiders. Did you know that, well, you all know, I'm sure, that eiders pluck their own belly feathers to make a nest for their ducklings. And this eider down, as they call it, is collected, especially in Iceland, to make eider down quilts. It takes the down from 60 nests to make one single eider down. A real eider down quilt, bought in Iceland, it would actually cost you about £2,200 for a single duvet cover, and about £4,500 for a double. And here's an iconic bird of Shetland. Lots of these around. I'm afraid they're very hard to get close to, so all my photos are a little bit fuzzy because they've been blown up so much. This is a red-throated diver. You can see the red throat there quite clearly. But they're beautifully marked. They've got lovely stripy necks. I think there's a picture here that shows their stripy neck much better. There you go. St. Ninians, we found about 7 divers altogether, and one of them, strangely, was in well, shall we say, I can't call it winter plumage because it's June, but it non-breeding plumage. You can see the chap on the right here. There he is. That is what they look like in the winter, and how we often see them down south here. Another iconic coastal bird, the red-breasted merganser. Quite a lot of those up there. It's a drake and a duck. Okay, so now we moved from Loch of Spiggy and we moved up to where that red pin is the hotel we stayed at up here, which was called Balter Sound. And it was just a short drive onto the island of Muckle Row. There is, in fact, a bridge going onto Muckle Row. And in that channel there, I found some interesting algae, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But first of all, here's the hotel. Something strange at this hotel. Strange for Shetland anyway. You getting the picture? Yes, trees. You don't find trees on Shetland, but here at Buster House, there are lots of them, which is a nice change. Anyway, back to the algae I was telling you about. On Muckle Row, there's a road bridge, and we stopped on the bridge and looked down into the water, and I began to see sugar kelp, but something strange. Here's a normal piece of sugar kelp, which I'm showing you here. This, in fact, this was on a BioBlitz down in Mothercombe a few years ago, but that's what it normally looks like. It's long and thin, and it's got this kind of seersucker appearance. But this is what I began to see in Muckle Row. I got all excited because I thought, wow, I think I found an invasive species which hasn't been recorded before. Here's a bit that we dragged out, and you can see the dimensions are just totally different. It looks a bit sugar kelpish, but it's totally the wrong shape. Very large. So by the way, I'm sorry, I should say, I checked with the MBA when I got home, and yes, this is just a strange variety that grows in very sheltered conditions up in Scotland. It is known to science, I'm afraid. Now, here's another northern speciality. We get them a bit down here, not so much these days, I think. It's called Dabbalox or Alaria esculenta, with its midrib and nice wavy edges. This is totally edible, apparently. Sometimes called winged kelp. It's very pretty. Here it is lying across a bed of what they now unimaginatively call common branched green weed. I mean, that's what they decided to call Cladophora rupestris now. Common branched green weed. Oh well. On the sand here, there's a lovely example of two confusion species side by side. The top one is the Hymenthalia, is it sea spaghetti, do they call it? And below it, there's mermaid's tresses or Corda phylum. Anyway, one day we took the boat from Lerwick to Bressay and Nos, these two islands, which are rightly famed for their gannet colonies. So let's have a quick look at Lerwick before we go. Lerwick is the central town of Shetland, famed for its Viking festival, which is in January. It's called Up Heliar. That's the actual name of the festival. And all the locals all get dressed up for the occasion. And everywhere you go in Lerwick, you can see photographs of them in their finery, dressed for Up Heliar Festival. I shouldn't think it would be a very pleasant time to go to Shetland actually in January, but still. This is a cafe in Lerwick showing all the Up Heliar stuff on the walls. And here is a typical seaside place in Lerwick. It reminded me of Appledore actually, and even the narrow streets. And this is the docks where we caught our little boat. And well, just before we go off on our boat, let's have a look at the Croft House Museum. This was it here, with its interesting roof, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Crofters cut peat. Here's a bank here, which is having peat logs cut from it. Here's one of the peat blocks that's been cut, just to show you the sort of dimensions you're looking at. And inside the museum, there's a peat fire. Obviously, it doesn't burn particularly clean by the looks of it. And there's a detail of the roof of the croft, which is grass, which is held on with a rope net weighted down with big flat stones. And here's one of their outhouses, which has got a boat on it as a roof. Anyway, off to Bresse and Nos from Lerwick on a little boat, and they're famed for having all sorts of seabird colonies on the ledges there, which we'll see in a second. This is a sea cave we stopped at on the way in. Inside it was very dark, but the skipper, it turned out, was a bit of a biologist, and he was to give us a bit of a treat because he had this most amazing toy, which I was very jealous of. It's kind of an underwater robotic camera which he could control from the wheelhouse with a computer. Yeah, and he showed us on the computer screen all sorts of wonderful creatures like this Luidia, this 7-armed starfish. And this is just an ordinary spiny starfish. And this one is rather purple in color. It's called Henrisia. And there were lots of urchins as well, sea urchins. Right, coming out of the cave, there's all these wonderful buttresses that we sailed under. And soon we were amongst the bird colonies here. You can see these wonderful ledges covered with all sorts of auks and seals. We began to see lots of common seals falling out on the rocks. This looked like a little family of a big bull and a pup and a cow. Right, we start to get up close and personal with the gannets of the area that share their ledges with guillemots by the looks of it. Here they are, all lined up. Notice how they're all nicely spaced. We can see some young ones here, which have got black in their plumage. You can see them better here. Now, this gannet is doing something which has been studied extensively, and it's called sky pointing. And it actually has a very specific meaning to gannets. It's the sign they make when they want to leave and go off fishing. And it's basically saying to their mate, you better stay here because I'm going to go fishing. And you've got to stay and look after the space or the egg or the baby or whatever they've got. So here he is taking off. Yeah. Beautiful birds. Right, you know, this must happen quite often because I saw it a few times. But of course, they've got to sort this out. It's a problem to them because they both want to go. Yeah, but I'm sure they do. And you can see the baby gannets much clearer there with their black and white wings. One fascinating point about gannet, did you know that they're completely without brood pouches, unlike other birds? And what they've got is very hot feet, and they brood their eggs by putting their feet on their eggs. They've also got binocular vision. You can see that one looking straight at us, and you can see both his eyes at once. The binocular vision, of course, is very important for judging distance, which they need when they're diving after fish. Here's one which looks as if he's carrying flowers. I'm not sure what that is. It's obviously some sort of seaweed. This one looks like it's got a fish. And here's what a young one must look like from underneath with his black patches on its wing. Here's one preening its mate's head. And notice the nesting material there, a big sheet of plastic. There's a lovely shot of a young bird. And a useful use for discarded fishing nets. Here's a herring gull amongst the gannets. I don't suppose he's a very welcome visitor, knowing what herring gulls are like if you've got eggs around. And there we are, Muriel. There's the black guillemot that you mentioned earlier. The black guillemot is in Scotland also called the taisty. And here they are in their brooding plumage. You can see, if you look closely, you can see their red feet under the water there. There's one sitting on the cliffs. There's a lovely shag. And above the shag, there's that daintiest of British gulls, the kittiwake. There's some more kittiwakes here, which they build nests, and they have black feet and yellow bills. And if you look at their wings, the tips are black, plain black. I say that because this is a very similar bird to look at. This is a common gull, but if you look at their wings, they've got white spots on their black wing tips, which are called mirrors, and their feet are green. And here's a black-headed gull that was in full breeding plumage, and he was spinning. They disturb the sediments so that they can pick up the tiny creatures that they disturb. And here's a lovely guillemot. Here you can see two plumage variations in guillemots. Have you seen the one on the left? Looks like he's wearing a pair of spectacles. That's called the bridled form. And they reckon that as you go further north, the bridled forms increase in frequency. In fact, in this, there's about 5-to-1 in this particular picture of bridled forms to non-bridled forms. Here's a razorbill. And this is the same bird diving, actually. When auks dive like this, they open their wings as they dive. So as they disappear under the water, you always see their wingtips sticking out like this. Right, with so many gannets, you can see that there's going to be, I'm afraid, some fatalities. And we came across this dead gannet floating in the water with a bonksy busy recycling it. Okay, so my next island, I suggest we have a break now, and the next island we're going to go to is Fetla. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the map, you can see what looks like the Loch of Funsey. Well, strangely enough, they don't pronounce it Funsey, they pronounce it Finny. But on the Loch of Finny, there's a very special bird which everybody goes to see. And this is a memorial that there is on the Loch of Finny to one Bobby Tulloch, who is a very fine birder. And to be honest, when I was a young boy in the 1960s, I belonged to the Young Ornithologists Club, and it was all a buzz in those days with the news that this fellow, Bobby Tulloch, had found on Fetla, Britain's very first ever breeding snowy owls. And there now there's a hide which looks out over the loch, and it was opened by Bobby Tulloch, as you can see here. The snowy owls, by the way, stayed on Fetler for 7 years, actually, and laid, they were very, very well studied. They laid 49 eggs, of which 23 of them fledged. But unfortunately, none of the birds actually stayed there. And in 1976, the male that did it all, he died, and they've never been there since, except as occasional vagrants, as you get anywhere these days. This is the bird which everybody gets excited about now. There's hundreds of birders go up to the Loch of Finny just to see this bird. This is the red-necked phalarope. It breeds on Fetler, and it winters in Peru. In case you don't know phalaropes, they're dainty little wading birds, which are perhaps unique in that they are considered to be pelagic. In other words, they spend a lot of their time swimming in the open ocean. This is the male. And one of these was geotagged recently, and his course was very closely followed as he went south for the winter. In fact, he left Fetler on August the 1st. He crossed the Atlantic to Canada in 6 days, and then he slowly worked his way down the eastern seaboard down to the Caribbean, where he got in early September. And then by mid-October, he was in the Galapagos Islands. And eventually he found his way to Peru. So there's his course. And he took 10 weeks, and he did 8,000 miles. And I suppose you've got to say that he probably went back much the same route. There doesn't seem to be much alternative when he returned to Shetland. So now this is a female phalarope, which you can see is a bit more strikingly marked than the male, prettier. In fact, she's bigger than the male. But this is the strange thing about phalaropes. They have sexual role reversal. It's the females that fight for territory, and they lay the eggs, but the males do everything else. They build the nests, they sit on the eggs, they feed the babies, they do everything. And while the male is caring for her, for his babies, shall we say, she is off trying to find another male to mate with. Di caught my obvious delight in seeing my first ever red-necked phalarope. Now, on the beach in Fetler, we came across Arctic terns feeding, and I was interested to watch them dip down into the water to catch fish. We actually witnessed this encounter between a black-headed gull that was obviously got himself a nice sand eel, but then the Arctic tern attacked it, just like a skewer, and made him drop the fish, and then made off with his ill-gotten gains himself. Now here's a strange picture that you don't actually see very often. In fact, I said to my traveling companion, you never see terns swimming. They don't ever swim. And then the next place we stopped, there were terns swimming. But in fact, they weren't actually swimming. They were bathing. But it was interesting to me. I'd never seen a tern in the water like this. Apart from diving into the water to catch a fish, you never see. Well, you don't normally see terns in the water. Not unlike gulls, of course. And of course, here's a group of iconic Shetland ponies on Fetler. They're tiny little horses. Some of them only 3 feet high at the shoulders, but they're much prized after as pets. They do a roaring trade, I believe. And on the way out of Shetland, we passed this place. I think someone just mentioned it. It's a salmon farm. It's a fish farm. They're huge up there. And this one is like a little floating island. You went up there in a boat, and then all the processing and thing is actually done inside that shed. Of course, it's beginning now to be quite controversial about these salmon, especially the way they're fed, and the fact that you have to catch wild fish and reduce them to pellets to feed the salmon. So they're not as economical as you might think. And of course, they encourage disease and masses of sea lice and all sorts. But anyway, let's not go there. So here is us arriving on Unst in the little ferry. Unst is the northernmost inhabited island in Great Britain. And as you go ashore there, you see this sign, which roughly translated, I put it underneath there, pause a moment and have a tune on the xylophone boat before you go, on the plinky boat. And there it is. Interesting. And next to it, there's a even more interesting cafe where you can get a cup of tea while you're waiting for your boat. Here's our hotel here. Interesting mixture of one old building and lots of add-on bits. But they were very pleasant. We stayed in one of these add-on bits, and it was very comfortable. So I stayed up that night. It was actually midsummer. It was the 21st of June, and I stayed up to take some photographs. This, believe it or not, is midnight. And this was 3 a.m. And this was 5 a.m. So there's hardly any darkness at all at that time of the year in Shetland. So they've even got a name for this simmer dim, as they call it, is that they have an ale named after it. And simmer dim actually means the midsummer twilight. I was at pains to point out to them, of course, that in Devon we have our own version, Devon Dimpsey. Anyway, a few shots just to show how wonderfully clear and clean this part of the world is, you know, with lots of lovely lichens on the rocks here. And such bright colours because the air is so good there. I mean, for photography purposes, the light is fabulous here in the summer. Here's some flowers, ragged robins and clover. And these were northern marsh orchids. And kingcups, lots of these in the marshes on Unst. They're like very large buttercups, sometimes called marsh marigolds as well. Oh, we came across a snipe sitting here. Yes, beautifully marked bird. Normally very well camouflaged, not so well here, of course. And we found some bluebells, strangely enough, all growing in the wild, may I say, no, not near anyone's houses. And there were blue ones, and there were white ones, and there were pink ones, all growing very, I can only imagine that they must have been escapes. This is a remote homestead called Haroldswick in Unst. The weather was absolutely glorious when we were up there. You know, we've been to Shetland, I would say, for about a month all told over the years, and it's never rained ever, touch wood, while we've been there. So obviously, maybe June is a good time to go. Now, in Balter Sound, there's a famous landmark. It's a bus shelter. I think there's probably about one bus a day. But the locals they do things to the bus shelter. They do it up, and it's decorated in a certain theme. That while we were there, the theme was Nelson Mandela, and it's amazing how much effort that they actually put into this. There's some words of wisdom there from the great man. Now, near the bus shelter, we saw some more Shetland ponies, different colours. And across the bay in Harrodswick, there's a Viking longship called the Skidbladna, with its associated longhouse. Can you see the turfy thing next to it? That is, in fact, a house. The Skidbladna is made of oak, and it could take about 70 men. Well, here's something I didn't know. Vikings invented the keel, apparently, and the rudder, and the compass. Obviously, great seafarers. So there's the longhouse, you can see there, which has got a turf roof. It was far too dark inside, I'm afraid, to take any useful pictures, but very cozy nonetheless. And you can see at the top of the wall there is the detail there showing how they lined the roof with birch bark and then lay turfs over the top of it. So this is a typical beach up in Unst, totally free of litter, absolutely pristine clean. And amongst these beaches, we began to find lots of breeding waders, like golden plovers. Now, this golden plover had some babies, but she obviously was telling them to keep their heads down, which they did. But it's a lovely shot of a golden plover, and I just marvel at how beautiful their plumage is. You can see why they're called golden. And the underside, pure black in the breeding season. And here was a Wimbrel, which breed up here as well, with his, as I said, with his brown crown stripe and his short bill. And here was a rather lovely lapwing. Once again, she had babies. But in this light, you can see why we also call them sometimes green plovers. And here's the little baby lapwing. Very pretty. And on the beach there were some more ring plovers, and with a little baby ring plover. Sorry, not a very good picture, but you get the picture there. Absolutely tiny, like little clockwork toys with outsized feet. And there's an oyster catcher with her baby. So lots of mothers and babies in Unst when we were there. This makes me think they must do most of their breeding in May, I would think. And the babies hatch out at the end of May, beginning of June. Here's the ruddy turnstone. And once again, the dunlin. And this one, you can see his black belly a lot better. And a redshank. These two redshanks were in a ditch as we were driving along the road, and we just stopped the car and wound down the window and took this photo of them right next to the car. They didn't seem particularly bothered about us. I think birds are more tolerant of human beings up there because they don't get much bother. There's a lovely portrait of a snipe. Right, so we visited Saxavoord up on the top of Unst, which is an RAF museum, because in the Cold War days, there was a forward listening station here with planes which were deployed here purely to see off Russian intruders. This is a bomber called a Bear, and one of our oh look, I forgot it. Tornado, of course, it's a tornado. The tornado is actually seeing it off. But they did this all the time to test our defences, apparently. Back in the day, the job would have been done by these Lightnings. There was displays of all sorts of aircraft in there. I've just put a few of them here. Of course, this is the most modern version, the Typhoon. But in the harbour there at Harrodswick, we found an otter who seemed to be catching crabs and eating them. Here he is crunching on a crab. I just wondered, you know, how pleasant it must be to swallow bits of crab shell. But there you go. And there are lots of interesting algae here as well, including this one which I haven't seen down south, sausage weed, Asperococcus. And this is gutweed and a bit of carrageen in there, I think, and also some creephorn. And amongst the kelp there, we can see a scallop shell. And here a lovely example of zonation over a very short period. You've got lichens at the top, you know, the usual Xanthoria, followed by Verrucaria, followed by Pelvicia, the channeled rack and spiral rack, and finally egg rack at the bottom. Lovely example. Anyway, so here we are at the top of Unst, and if you look at the top right-hand side, I'm hoping you can see a place called Skaw, S-K-A-W, Skaw, and that is where we're headed to now. This is Skaw, and with its part of its beach here, and we settled down here for a nice picnic next to the beach, with a picnic supplied by our hotel in lieu of lunch. We're joined by this magnificent bee, which apparently only occurs in Shetland. It is actually called the Shetland bumblebee. Total unique endemic species. And this is the only other endemic species that I saw, which is the Shetland wren. It apparently is different to our wren. It's redder in colour and it has a bard underneath. Here's one singing from the rooftop. These are called Troglodytes zetlandicus for coming from Shetland. It's not a separate species, it's just a subspecies of our wren. We admired the ample wildflowers up here in the beautiful light, including these trefoils and campions here. And I was able to admire some more beautiful algae in the rock pools here. Here's me getting those pictures of Davilox I showed you earlier. And this is a wonderful piece of fur bellows, which I found on the beach up at Skua. But anyway, as we were walking along this beach, we came across a nest of an Arctic tern. Uh-oh. It's not a good idea, actually, to go near an Arctic tern's nest. So we backed off, but nevertheless, I'm afraid, although the female sat tight for a while, the male wasn't having us being anywhere near, even on the beach. It was too much for him. And he started on us. And they're very intimidating. They dive at you. You've got to wear a hat because otherwise you get your head pecked. And soon there were both of them joining in. And although I promised I was nowhere near the nest, but they decided that their blood was up and they decided they were going to see me off. And they fly straight at you, screaming their heads off. So you've got to keep your nerve, and if you're lucky, you can get some really good photos of them coming straight at you, like this, closer and closer. Yeah. But they are fabulous birds, nonetheless. They normally veer off at the last moment. They very seldom do they actually hit you. My friend Peter getting some close attention here. And one of them decided, yeah, he got bombed. Now I include this because it's got nothing to do with Shetland. I actually took this photo many years ago on the Farne Islands in Northumberland. And as you get off the boat in the Farne Islands, you have to walk up a path, and the Arctic terns actually nest on the path. So you cannot avoid them. You have to go right past their nests, and they just sit there and scream at you or attack you. In fact, I've got a photo somewhere which I couldn't find, I'm afraid, of one of these actually sitting on my head, pecking my head. So anyway, from Skor, our next stop is Hermanus. Now, this is the end of our journey up in Hermanus. You can see at the top there, Muckleflugger Lighthouse, which is the actual end of the United Kingdom, if you like. Yeah. So I'm now going to take you around to Hermanus. There's the lighthouse and bird observatory at Hermanus. And from the bird observatory, you walk along this beautifully appointed boardwalk, which goes through all the marshy ground until you get up amongst the birds at the end. And as you go, of course, there's all these marshy plants like these beautiful insectivorous sundews around you, and some even more beautiful marsh orchids, and lots and lots and lots of bonxies. These were the highlight of our trip to Hermanus. They were fantastic, and we were able to get some amazing photographs of bonxies. I love this one, which shows a peat pool, the bonxie having a drink and a bathe, and the pool is reflecting the beautiful blue sky above. And the bonxies here have obviously finished breeding, and they're quite calm. Apparently, you don't go near bonxies. If you think Arctic terns are bad, then bonxies are 10 times worse, and you don't go near them at all when they're actually breeding. But they finished breeding now, so they were just sitting quietly amongst the grass, and allowed us to get very, very close. As you can see, I got some fabulous portraits of bonxies here. I'm not sure about the white feathers, whether they signify that it's a young bird. Probably does. Here's one having a stretch. This one was sitting right in the middle of the path as we were walking along, and just literally refused to budge. And we had to take a wide berth and go right round it. But you can see how powerful they are. Looks like a pair here, but you can't tell really. Maybe not. Might be brother and sister for all I know. So here's what the tip of Hermanus Nature Reserve look like. It is a nature reserve, by the way. It is the most northerly nature reserve in Great Britain. And on this particular day, we were lucky because the weather was just like this. And in the distance, you can see those big white rocks where they're white with guano and gannets. They are actually covered with gannets. You can't begin to understand how many gannets there were in this area at this time. I wouldn't like to do that exercise I did before with the guillemots here, because there must be thousands of birds in this one photograph. Anyway, below us in the sea, we see for the last time, we see our darling little puffins all floating on the water, or just resting. Actually, I don't think they were actually feeding. I think they were just resting in the water. And there was a little group on the cliffs just below us here, which I was able to get close to with the lens. There they are in the bright sunshine, enjoying themselves. And there we go. There's a bonksy sitting as close to the edge of Great Britain as you possibly could. And in the distance, looking north over the lighthouse there is actually nothing. If you look at the globe, there's nothing between this point and the North Pole. Nothing at all. It's just Arctic Ocean. So here's the island, taken with the lens, of course, of Muckleflugga. Like all lighthouses, I'm afraid it's no longer manned, so there's nobody lives there. So the prize for their most northerly resident of Great Britain goes to someone who lives in Score, because nobody lives here anymore. They visit it, obviously, for maintenance, but in fact, the lighthouse is totally automatic now. But you can see the ladders up from the rocks there to get to it. That's the island of Muckleflugga. And in fact, 600 meters beyond Muckleflugga is this rock, which is called Outstack. And that really is the most northerly of the British Isles. There is nothing beyond that. So here's Hermines. It's a very beautiful and wild and atmospheric place. If you like crowds, don't bother going to Shetland. It's a very lonely place. Here's my friend Rachel having a picnic, the only person for miles. The beaches all look like this. They're totally deserted. They're beautiful, pristine, white sand with not a trace of plastic or rubbish anywhere to be seen. We've really loved our visits here, and no doubt we'll go back again one day. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Shetland. Thanks for listening.